If you're new here, welcome, and if you've been with us before, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We break down cases that blur the lines between love and violence. And today you'll hear the story of Emily Noble, a 52-year-old woman who vanished after celebrating her birthday, and whose disappearance would become a mystery defined by strange interviews, a staged scene, and a trial that left a town divided. The details are messy, and they demand we look closely. She was small, described by those who loved her as slight and quiet. With a laugh that could turn a room lighter, Emily Noble lived in Westerville, Ohio. She celebrated her 52nd birthday late on a Saturday night in May 2020, and the story that unfolded in the days after would become a strange public plea for help, followed by 4 months of searching, and then the discovery that would force investigators and the community to ask whether grief had been genuine or performative, and whether the truth had been hidden in plain sight. The narrative the public first heard came from Matheau Moore, the man Emily married in 2018, who was the one to report her missing on May 25, 2020, hours after they had spent the evening out together celebrating her birthday. The next morning, Matheau told police that Emily had simply taken a walk and not returned. He said she must have vanished in the night, leaving behind her phone, wallet, and car keys at home, and he immediately and publicly pleaded for help, even asking a podcast to feature her case, an episode that would later be replayed for investigators and jurors and the nation as he sat with hosts and spoke about the fear of losing his wife. The interview left listeners unsettled, not only by the desperation, but by the oddness of some details and the way dates and facts were muddled. And that unease would become a thread investigators pulled at during a long, painstaking inquiry. On May 24th, according to security footage and witness accounts, Emily and Matheau went out for dinner, then to at least 2 local bars. Leaving the area late in the evening, cameras captured them together. They appeared as a typical couple on a night out, and yet within hours a different reality would emerge. At first, the missing persons investigation followed typical paths. Neighbors were asked, routes checked, cell tower pings reviewed, social media posts circulated. A community lit candles and joined search parties through wooded parcels close to the couple's home. Law enforcement treated the disappearance seriously because Emily had not taken her usual routines, and because the circumstances described by Matheau didn't line up neatly with the physical evidence. And as days turned into weeks, the absence of Emily's presence became an ache that pulsed through Westerville. It would be September 16, 2020, before searchers found a body in the woods not far from where Emily and Matheau lived. The remains were badly decomposed, and investigators had to rely on dental records for identification. The body was found hanging from a tree, a USB-style cord tied to a branch. And initial impressions of suicide turned quickly into suspicion of homicide once forensic specialists examined the injuries. A strangulation expert would later testify that fractures to Emily's face and neck were inconsistent with self-inflicted hanging and more consistent with violent manual strangulation, and that led to a dramatic shift in the investigation. A missing woman's case became a homicide inquiry. The discovery was devastating and complicated. The way the scene had been arranged suggested staging, and staging suggests intent to mislead. And when detectives dug deeper, they began to piece together a timeline of the last hours Emily was seen alive, and they found inconsistencies, small misalignments in stories about where people were and when, details that by themselves are not proof, but when stacked together can form a troubling pattern. We'll pause here to remember Emily as family and friends did. Not as the headline. There are home photos of her laughing, a woman who loved the woods and quiet, and behind the public plea for help there were private relationships and histories that would come under scrutiny. She left a gap people rushed to fill, and as investigators examined the evidence, the questions multiplied. Who last saw her? What injuries did she sustain? And who might have wanted to hide the truth? Detectives would eventually charge Matheau Moore with the murder, 2 counts of murder and a count of felonious assault. Their theory was that Emily had been brutally beaten and strangled, then hung in an attempt to make her death look like suicide. Those charges came after months of work and after forensic findings that included significant face and neck trauma. The public learned of the charges in June of 2021, and for many the arrest answered the unanswerable question of why Emily had not returned home. But for others, the case opened up a courtroom battle over what evidence truly proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case leaned on the physical injury evidence and on the idea that the scene had been staged. They argued that Emily's wounds told a story of violence, and that the positioning of her body and the cord was a deliberate attempt to disguise the cause of death. They presented testimony from forensic specialists, searchers, and detectives. They painted a picture of a murder followed by a hurried attempt to cover it up. While the defense countered with alternative explanations, they questioned whether decomposition complicated the ability to know the exact cause and timing of injuries, and they asked jurors to consider whether the proof reached the highest bar required in the American legal system. Trials are staged dramas of their own, and this one would be no different. Voices and testimonies became the threads jurors wove together to form belief. The defense argued for reasonable doubt. They pointed to the chaotic nature of the podcast interview Matheau gave and said that odd behavior does not equal guilt. And they emphasized that many people, when stressed and grieving, say things that sound strange. And sometimes details are misremembered. The jury would hear it all and decide whether the state had proved its case. If you're finding this story gripping and you want detailed videos like this, please do subscribe, like the video, share, and leave your thoughts below. Prosecutors described Emily's skull and neck fractures and told jurors those injuries were not the result of hanging, but of a violent assault. They explained how the body had been moved and how the cord was used to suggest suicide. Defense lawyers countered by highlighting gaps and uncertainties that emerged from a body that had been exposed to the elements for months. Decomposition obscures things and time erodes certainty. And reasonable doubt is a powerful force in a jury room, and so the case moved from news headlines to the moral and legal weighing of evidence. Members of the community followed the trial with a mixture of grief and hunger for justice. There were victims' advocates who wanted accountability, and others who worried about presuming someone guilty before a verdict. When the jury returned its decision in late August of 2022, they found Matheau not guilty. The verdict shocked many who had believed the physical evidence spoke clearly. It vindicated those who argued the state did not meet its burden, and it left unanswered questions that would echo long after the courtroom emptied. An acquittal is not an exoneration in the court of public opinion, and it doesn't reconstruct what happened to Emily. It simply means the jury was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. For some, the result felt like a failure of the system. For others, it affirmed the protections that prevent the state from punishing without proof. And across town, the void remained where Emily once was. Hallways and rooms remained softer with her absence. Friends and family kept searching for closure in their own ways. There is another layer to this case that haunted people who watched and listened closely. Matheau's public outreach included an unusual plea to the producers of the Vanished podcast. He specifically asked for their help. Producers obliged and later described the interview as strange, not only because of small misstatements about dates and details, but because of the tone and self-presentation. The podcast clip became a piece of evidence in the court of public perception because it revealed behavior that some interpreted as manipulative and others as desperate. Human psychology and trauma can look unpredictable and sometimes unreadable, and the way that behavior was consumed by a public hungry for narrative complicated the search for truth. Let's pull apart the timeline and the evidence the prosecution relied on. Early in the investigation, law enforcement reported Emily's car, keys, phone, and wallet were still in the home. That's significant because people who leave intentionally often take some personal items. Investigators then focused on the couple's movements on the evening of May 24th. Video showed them entering a restaurant and leaving together. But the crucial hours where Emily disappeared were murky, Matheau reported last seeing her on the night of their outing, and said he slept through the night, waking the next morning to find her gone, and he called friends and police to report her missing. That timeline left investigators with a narrow window to reconstruct and many small, unanswered questions about what happened while neighbors slept, and the town grew cold with worry. When Emily's remains were discovered on September 16th, the condition of the body complicated precise forensic timing, but experts were able to identify trauma to her face and neck. Investigators called those fractures indicative of homicide, and forensic testimony claimed that the hanging was staged to disguise other injuries. The presence of manual strangulation indicators is a key piece of a prosecutor's theory because it suggests an assault prior to the staging, and staging suggests consciousness of wrongdoing, an element prosecutors use to argue for intent. A medical expert explained that even after decomposition, certain fractures and patterned injuries are identifiable, and those patterns tell investigators whether pressure was applied by hands or by suspension. The pathologist's testimony would be central. It was technical and sobering, and it would be met by defense arguments about the limits of what can be known after months of exposure. Defense attorneys emphasized that decomposition makes definitive conclusions harder, and that environmental factors can mimic or obscure injuries. They also argued that the state's timeline was uncertain and that circumstantial evidence could not be stretched into certainty. The defense sought to keep jurors focused on the legal standard. Beyond a reasonable doubt, jurors must be certain, and if they had reasonable questions, they had to acquit. Jurors wrestled with witness testimony, expert analysis, and sometimes surprisingly human elements. The way a grieving person speaks, the slipping of dates, the odd jokes made at the wrong time. The public had already formed narratives about Matheau. Some said the podcast interview showed a man who manufactured grief for sympathy. Others said it was the behavior of someone exhausted and terrified. The jury's job was to leave those public stories aside and weigh the admissible evidence. After the not guilty verdict, the local media and national outlets revisited the case. Podcasts and shows replayed interviews and experts weighed in. Dateline and other programs renewed interest and raised new questions about unresolved aspects of the case. Emily's family continued to grieve, and the community debated whether justice had been served or whether the truth remained hidden beneath a canopy of suggestion and contradiction. I know you already considered subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us keep digging and presenting these stories carefully and respectfully. Across this entire story, the human texture is large. Friends who described Emily as warm and small in frame. Family members who lit candles and kept vigil. Neighbors who remember search parties combing the woods. And then the gaping, finality of identification by dental records. The mechanistic act of matching teeth to a file. That clinical moment collides with the emotional rupture of a family being told the worst. It is a brutal intersection of science and sorrow. The noble case sits in a broader conversation about how we interpret grief and odd behavior. It raises questions about the role of media in shaping public opinion and about how investigators interpret staged scenes. Staging is itself a phenomenon often seen in cases where killers attempt to shift narratives. But proving staging beyond the presence of an altered scene requires connecting that staging to an actor, a timeline, and motive. The gap between evidence of staging and proof a particular person staged it is sometimes unbridgeable in court, and that friction between what we suspect and what can be proven is why jury decisions sometimes surprise the public. To understand why jurors hesitated, consider the standard of proof. The court doesn't ask who probably did it. It asks whether the state proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors must reconcile expert testimony about trauma with the realities of decomposition and conflicting witness recollections. The defense's job is to introduce uncertainty, and the prosecution's job is to close it. In this case, the jury concluded the prosecution had not closed the gap to their satisfaction. Friends remember Emily as a woman who loved the outdoors and quiet evenings. A neighbor said she liked walking. Another recalled her smile at block gatherings. Those memories resist being flattened into a single explanation. A life is always more than a headline, and Emily's life before that night is a mosaic of small, ordinary moments that made her beloved by some and familiar to others in a way that makes her absence felt in the waiting places where she should have been. What does walking away mean? And who chooses the narrative of disappearance? Sometimes it's a person leaving a life by choice. Sometimes it's violence. And sometimes the line between the two is what investigators must determine. This case shows the limits of both science and storytelling. We can measure fractures and establish timelines with a degree of certainty, but the human motives and private moments are often obscured by the darkness of the unknown. Legally, the not guilty verdict closed one chapter, but it did not resurrect Emily. It did not definitively answer who inflicted the injuries or why. It left open the possibility of other leads or evidence that might one day change the public record. Cold cases sometimes awaken years later with new forensic tools or witness recollections, until such a moment arrives. Communities live with the tension of unresolved loss, and the noble family, like others caught in the crosshairs of violent loss, continue their private search for explanation and solace. On that quiet stretch of woods where Emily's remains were found, flowers and notes still appear from time to time. People place small tributes and whisper names into trees, acts of remembrance that are human and small and persistent in the face of everything we cannot know. And those acts matter because they insist on the value of a life beyond the case file. This is a story without a tidy resolution. It is a story that asks hard questions about how we judge behavior in the public eye, how forensic certainty is shaped by time and environment, and how families are left with a void regardless of verdicts. Emily Noble's life and disappearance remain for many a wound still being felt and for others a complicated legal caution about what the burden of proof really means. If you found this deep dive helpful, please like, subscribe, and share this episode. We tell these stories to remember victims and to push for clarity in cases where answers are few. Also, we will like you to leave your thoughts below. I certainly do not think Emily took her own life. Always remember, if you feel unsafe at any point, walk away. Immediately, a second of wait might be too late. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.